From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there, and welcome to Chicago Newsroom. On this day, Thursday, September 6th, as we record today's show, this is what a political observer I know called Day 2 of the new political order in Chicago. Rahm Emanuel has a little more than 250 days left in office because, with or without Pat Quinn's advice, Emanuel decided to term limit himself. And if his reversal yesterday on the making a report every time a police officer points a gun at someone policy, he now favors it, if that reversal says anything, it may be that the mayor fully intends to take full advantage of his power while he's got it. We'll see. And when this newly freed and empowered mayor said yesterday that in essence Chicago's next mayor hasn't announced their candidacy yet, it meant that the 10 or 12 people already declared in the race might be facing some new realities in this new political order. On May 3rd of this year, 2016, Troy LaRaviere became the first candidate to formally announce for mayor. But he'd been running for the office, in my opinion, for a long time. His passionate defense of public education as principal of Blaine Elementary, later as head of the Principals Association, kept him in the news for years, and he's had a large number of passionate followers. But like the other already announced candidates, fundraising is a struggle, and it can be difficult to cut through the clutter of daily news briefs to get recognition. So we're doing what we can here on Chicago Newsroom, having full-length conversations with, well, I was going to say each of the announced candidates, but we don't know what that means anymore. Anyway, it's our privilege to have Troy LaRaviere, a self-described, unapologetically progressive candidate for the working people, with us here today.
Thanks
Troy,
for having
welcome
me.
back. It's a pleasure to have you back at the table. We begin today. Now let's see. You're here somewhere. It's in alphabetical order. There you are. There you are. You were first, and now it's this. I thought of you when I read the Reader. Ryan Smith wrote in the Reader that what we're seeing, not only in Rahm Emanuel, but in our politics in general, may be the decline of technocratic centrism of the Clinton and sort of Obama-Clinton variety. You see that?
What I see, I don't necessarily see technocratic centrism as having ruled the day. What I've seen rule the day is having our politicians serve the interests of the 1%. Mm-hmm. And that's not on the decline. Emanuel may have left the race, but the interests that he served, the banks that have indebted us to them for billions of dollars, the real estate developers who are pushing people out of neighborhoods that they've lived in their entire lives and made them unaffordable, those interests rule the day, and they're not going anywhere. They're going to get themselves behind a candidate. That comment was quite interesting in terms of the candidate hasn't entered the race yet. Mm-hmm. Maybe he knows something we don't know in terms of now that they have made the decision that they can't run City Hall through him, who are they going to try to run City Hall through now? They're certainly going to put their money behind someone.
I heard you on Patty Vasquez's show a couple nights ago. Right. And you spun out this idea that maybe the big developers and bankers and all the folks who have bankrolled, the billionaires who have bankrolled the mayor, for some reason decided that it was time to switch horses. I mean, I don't know why they would do that, but is that what you think happened?
Again, this is not about Rahm. Rahm ran the city for them. Mm-hmm. Right? They run the city. The privatization of our school system is not his idea. Right? It's their idea. It's their agenda. Indebting us to banks with toxic loans, that's not his idea. That's their ideas, and they want that process. They need that process. The gravy train from our pockets to theirs has to continue, and they have to get a candidate in office to make that happen. And I believe that they made the assessment that their chances of controlling the mayor's office were not as well, were no longer good. They did not have a good chance
for third term?
Right. Their chances of running the mayor's office through him were no longer good because his chances of being reelected were getting slimmer and slimmer. And I think they decided they needed to bail on him and find a candidate that didn't have the baggage that he had, but would institute the same policies for them that he'd been instituting. And so for me and for voters, I think the key right now is to look at who the real estate developers put their money behind. Who are the banks going to be putting their money behind? Because that's going to be the candidate that is not serving our interests, but is going to be serving the same interests he served. We have to make sure, that's why I tell folk at every opportunity, I don't take campaign contributions from big banks. I don't ask or take campaign contributions from real estate developers or any large corporation that's seeking to get city contracts, so that when I am elected mayor, the only people I'm going to owe are the people I'm sworn to serve. And I don't think there are many candidates in the race who can say that.
They haven't been calling you then and asking you if you would like to be their pony in this race?
No, sir. I think they've gotten the message that I'm not for sale.
So I have this kind of fantasy thing about what happens when you win, when you become mayor, you or any candidate, but let's say it's you. And after all of the cheering dies down and you walk into the office on the first morning for your first day in the office, you will get about 418 phone calls, and you will be spending much of the day talking to people who are calling you just to check in and find out. And I made a little short list. Like, for example, Mike Madigan will be on the phone, and he'll say, well, Troy, you know that we're here to work together on this. What are your legislative priorities? And you say?
The first thing is ensuring that we invest equitably in every community in this city. I think the lack of economic development, the lack of equitable investment. I have this thing I call the Ferris wheel test. And we are all, if you watch this show, you're probably familiar with the $55 million that we spent.
Swap.
The $55 million that we spent on Navy Pier for the most part, to refurbish a Ferris wheel. Now, take that and compare it with the Neighborhood Opportunity Fund that the city touts and the mayor's office touts quite a bit in relationship to investments in the south and west sides. The entire south and west side. Now, how much money so far has been spent on the entire west side and south
I've
side?
cheated, I know the number. It's 11 million, isn't
Right,
it?
it's $11 million. $11 million for the 2/3 of the city, $55 million on one project. 5 times as much. That is the height of inequity. That when we get into office, the priority is going to be flipping that reality. We're going to spend, and that $55 million, that doesn't include the hundreds of millions that get spent downtown on a whole. That's just one project. So we're going to flip that and spend hundreds of millions in the neighborhoods, on the south side, on the west side, and even some north side neighborhoods that need development.
I think,
and let downtown develop itself with the massive amount of private capital that it already has.
by the way, it didn't refurbish the Ferris wheel. It actually replaced a Ferris wheel that was too small. But nevertheless, I do think that there's it's a little bit of apples and oranges here, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about TIF money, and again, I'm not saying this in defense of what happened, but this was TIF money that had originally been allocated, I think, for the stadium, and then it got moved to the hotel, and then the hotel swapped it over and all that. But the Neighborhood Opportunity Fund is something that's really completely different. It's not really public money in a sense. It's money that developers are extorted into giving to the city because they don't want to put low-income people in their developments, so they give money to the city, and then the mayor doles it out on the west and south sides.
It's apples and oranges.
It's not exactly city money, right?
It's apples and oranges if your focus is on the origination of where the money came from. That's not my focus. My focus is on a comparative analysis of the relative investment. 55 million, wherever it came from, is 55 million public dollars. And wherever it came from, there are billions of public dollars going into downtown. And wherever it came from, what you're touting as an investment on the south and west sides is 5 times less than what you put into one project. So let's not pretend like this is some kind of game-changing event. When they call it the Neighborhood Opportunity Fund, I think the opportunity is the only true word there because it's a press opportunity. That's what it is. The south and west side need billions of dollars. in investments.
Yes, they do.
And that's the kind of thing that needs to be done, and then that's the kind of thing that needs to be touted. But I get your point in relationships to apples and oranges, but that's not the focus of my comparison.
I get
the
that
focus
too.
of my comparison is to say, this is not going to do the job.
We have to interrupt your phone call because Andy Glore is on the other line from Sterling Bay, and he wants to know, Troy, we're okay with Lincoln Yards, aren't we? I mean, we're going to move forward with Lincoln Yards.
So I am not in favor of putting public money into projects that are designed to benefit and profit private enterprise. I think that private enterprise has enough accumulated capital to the point where you don't need what amounts to a public welfare subsidy from us to develop your project. I am not necessarily against private development in general. What I am against is treating the Chicago taxpayers like we are supposed to be, the payers or the people paying out welfare payments to these developers. Yeah. Now, in instances, I can bend on that a little bit in the sense that if it becomes necessary to do that kind of thing, if there is some risk involved, one of the things that I would add to the public subsidy is a requirement to pay it back when the project becomes profitable so that taxpayers get their money back. If there is some risk here.
Kind of like the auto loan, auto company loans.
Exactly, but what happened under Daley, what happened under Rahm, and what's going to continue to happen if we allow them to put someone else into the mayor's office who's going to serve their needs is that money ends up going to them to pad their profits. We never see a return on that investment. They get a return on our investment, and we end up losing not only the original amount we invested, but typically that investment involves land that is no longer, because it's owned publicly sometimes, because public money bought the land, is no longer part of the tax base, and then we end up having to pay more in property taxes. And so we lose twice.
Well, there's actually two pots of this. I mean, some of it is TIF money, for example, and just direct payments to developers. And the other is what we're seeing with Amazon, that you can offer up to $2 billion in basically obligations that you don't have to pay, taxes and that kind of thing, right? So,
and then we end up
having to pay. That pot has to be filled by some other means.
Right. With the Amazon deal, it's another good example of just bad economic policy. And again, I'm not against companies coming in, but when you're talking about the limited amount of public money that we have, we have to invest that in the most intelligent manner possible. And so we have to look at the research on what actually has been proven to work in developing resilient, strong economies. And what's been shown to work, the data says that economies where there is a high ratio of businesses to residents are typically more resilient and more likely to stay strong in the face of national downturns. What that means in layman's terms is the more small businesses you have per resident, the stronger your economy. So what does that say about where we should focus our investments? To have a strong economy that's strong in the long term, in one giant corporation coming in, or in developing the talent and the entrepreneurial spirit and the folks, the entrepreneurs right here in this city, so that we can increase the ratio of businesses to residents and have a strong economy. That's where public money should be going, not necessarily taking an adversarial stance against private companies coming in, but you're not going to be getting public money to do that. You're going to be using the vast amount of private capital that you already have.
I'm almost reluctant to dive into this vat of goo, but the problem you have whenever any of these conversations happen, they always come down to this thing about employment and jobs and training and job training and all that stuff. And I am just becoming more and more cynical about it and believing that there just aren't jobs and that the number of jobs, just the total number of jobs available on this planet is decreasing by about 0.5% every single day. And I don't know what that means. I mean, your background is in education, and it's a good, solid background. You have all the credentials you need, but what are you training your students for? What happens when they get out? And in parallel, the whole question about we're just so gung-ho of sending everybody to college and getting their parents indebted, and they lose their house, they lose their inheritance over it, and then they come out with a worthless degree that doesn't get them a job. I mean, this is big stuff, but go ahead.
And so when I've talked to people, two strands of thought there. When I've talked to people in the manufacturing industry and the tech industry, I'm told quite often that there are jobs available that we don't have people trained to do.
Yeah, me too.
And I went to Dunbar Vocational High School.
Prosser Vocational High School.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So I remember walking through the halls of Dunbar and going past the brick shop, going past the carpentry shop, going past the auto shop, the aviation shop. There was a helicopter in my high school.
Is that right?
A helicopter.
Yeah.
And I would go by and just sort of stare at other young men and women like me working on a helicopter, getting the skills they need. We have gone away from that as a city, and we have to return to it. In the atrium of my high school, there was a house, Ken. There was a house.
I know.
Do you know who built that house?
Students.
Students
Yes.
at that school.
Yes.
Right?
Electricians,
skills,
carpenters.
right? We haven't stopped building things here. Like, we have to prepare the young people of Chicago to take on those jobs. And the other thing I have to talk about in relationship to the overall point about jobs is we have been bleeding public jobs for decades. I think we've lost probably 10,000 teachers.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. Good, I can check that one off my list. Yes, let's get into that.
And so we may have lost more than 10. I think I heard the CTU cite a stat of 10,000 teachers lost over the last couple decades. Now, that's 10,000 people who used to live out in the neighborhoods of this city, who paid rent, who paid a mortgage, who were in a home that is now a vacant lot that's an eyesore.
Yeah.
And when they lost their jobs, those people, before they lost their jobs, they were visiting and patronizing the local businesses in their community.
Yeah.
So when they lost their public jobs, that's an apartment that's no longer being rented. Those businesses are no longer have the customer base of people with a public job, and so they're closing down, and then the people who work for them then lose their jobs. And so I think having an extremely strong and resilient public sector employment initiative is key to bringing back not just the public employment directly, but supporting many of the private businesses and industries that need those dollars from those public employees to thrive themselves.
So you don't think it's a great idea to fire a person who's earning $45,000 a year as a city employee and bring in a $9 an hour temp?
It's bad on two levels. That not only does that
Doesn't
$9
that save me money as a taxpayer?
No, it doesn't. It ends up.
That's okay. I'm just feeding you.
I know. It ends up hurting you in the long run because it is damaging to the city that you live in.
Yep.
And so not only does that worker get paid less, and that worker cannot spend as much in the local economy, but that private employer, you're not paying less as a city. That private employer, take Aramark, for example.
Yes, let's take Aramark.
I think that's probably what you're thinking
Didn't they
about.
get a contract with the schools or something?
Right, they got a contract with the Chicago Public Schools,
Yeah.
supposedly to keep our schools clean. We all know now that they left our schools filthy and continue to leave our schools filthy.
I read about
they
that
underpay
somewhere,
their
yeah.
employees.
Yeah.
So what we end up doing, now we're not spending any less on custodial services. We just privatize them. The employees are getting less, and more of the money, a greater share of the money that we spend now is going to this corporation that is based out of where? Philadelphia. And so we're spending massive amounts of taxpayer dollars to Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And that money in Philadelphia is no longer in circulation in our local economy. It makes absolutely no sense unless you understand how corrupt City Hall is.
This is. I think this might be the number one topic at this table. the city talks about, okay, we could save a lot of money if we had private sector people picking up our garbage, right? So there's this discussion about how much money could be saved. Well, again, that's even debatable in itself. But what happens is the same amount of money gets spent.
That's right, or more.
But the workers who are going to be replacing those union workers get about 2/3 or maybe half of what the original worker was getting. And there's this middle thing that gets built in the middle here, which is all the managers, all the private sector managers. And this conversation goes back to charter schools. It's the same thing.
Exactly.
We had a situation with my mind blanks, but the group of charter schools that got into all the trouble. And you
Uno?
had Uno, yeah. And you had a principal or you had a group of principals who were, or a superintendent, I should say, who was responsible for like 9 or 10 schools and was being paid about the same amount of money as the Chicago public school superintendent, right? We're still paying that. We taxpayers are paying that. So we're paying for a level of middle management, but it becomes invisible because it's not on the public. It's not on the public in the public budget documents. So we're paying as much and getting less. And that if you could accomplish anything in this mayoral run of yours, if you could teach Chicago that privatization doesn't necessarily save them money, you'd have done a great public service.
So that's going to certainly be a strong theme in our campaign. Absolutely. And in relationship to the point that you're making, many of those people, and so in CPS, for example, our school-based engineers were over our custodians. And so the custodians had someone right there on site supervising them. You have to hear this. And so they came in, Forrest Claypool and Tim Cawley, the mayor hired Tim Cawley to do this. He came in and decided, okay, the custodian reports to the engineer reports to the principal. We're going to remove the engineer from this relationship. Custodians, you report to the principal. As principals, we were thinking, what in the world are they doing?
So now I got to schedule people who mop the floor.
And the engineer's still in the building.
Right.
Still in the building. And we're like, why are they doing this? And so then he comes in and says, principals, I know this is a problem for you. We solved the problem. We're going to bring in a private company to manage the custodians for you. And you're going to have a supervisor. If there's any problem, you have this supervisor who you can call on, and he'll manage your custodians and take care of the problems.
Except he's going to be doing 20 schools.
In 20, 30 schools. And with the engineer still in the building. Right? Just a massive waste of money. And so what principals end up having to deal with is a supervisor who they may see once a month, twice a month, who is not actually, it's off-site mismanagement. They call it off-site management. It's off-site management. It's absentee management that we are, and again, we're still paying these people as much, we're still spending as much money on custodial services, but in order to save money, the company we're paying the money to is depleting staff and keeping the massive amount of profit that they continue to get from the contract they have with the city, and using that and put it in their own bank account.
That poor guy who's earning $10 an hour with no benefits is now becoming more of a liability in the community that he lives in, because the community needs to do more to support him because he can't go to the store and buy the things he needs, and around down and down the spiral goes. By the way, I just got a notice that your next call is from Kevin Graham. He says, "Hey Troy, where are you at on our contract for the police?" He's, by the way, the head of the police union. What are we doing about this? You've been in office for like 8 hours already. I want to know what's going on. We need that contract. Where is it?
And so I believe and trust in evidence. I believe and trust in research. And some of the best evidence and best research on our police department was done by the United States Department of Justice. They had 99 different recommendations for what needs to happen to reform our police department. They found a pattern and practice of unconstitutional use of force, documented unconstitutional use of force, particularly against African American people in this city. They found that that unconstitutional use of force was allowed to go rampant because of, one, a lack of proper training, and two, a lack of supervision. Lack of training and a lack of supervision, and also a lack of accountability. And they recommended changes to that contract. Changes like the 24-hour waiting period, where you could wait 24 hours before being questioned. Changes that prevent officers from being able to communicate and get their stories synchronized before having to put a statement.
The 24 hours is for officers, right?
Right.
Not for the public, but for officers.
Not for the public.
Yeah.
Changes like having people have to sign a legal document before complaining, filing a complaint to police, an affidavit, signing an affidavit. And one of the things against the affidavit argument, people try to confuse the affidavit argument, like, well, if you're going to accuse someone of something, you should have to, like, if what we have to understand is that filing a report isn't the same as filing charges against a police officer. I think if it gets to a point where an officer ends up in court as a result of the complaint that you filed, then of course you're going to have to sign an affidavit. But you should not have to sign an affidavit just to have someone look into the behavior of a police officer as a result of your complaint. And so I support every one of the 99 recommendations that the Department of Justice made, and every single one of them that impacts the union contract. I'm going to be pushing to ensure that we see those through.
Okay, but what are you going to do about my contract? I'm Kevin Graham. You know?
Right.
Yeah.
I know
what are you going to
did
do?
it.
What are you going to do?
I'm going to be pushing to ensure that.
But we don't want any of those things.
I know you. I know they don't want them.
We are not going to allow you to put them in there.
Well, that's going to be a debate and a fight that I'm ready to take on, because I'm going to do everything I can as mayor to ensure that police are held accountable by the same standards you would hold anybody else accountable to when it comes to respecting the constitutional rights of our citizens. At the same time,
so you don't respect the police.
At the same time, I'm going to ensure that police get the support, training, and capacity building they need. When I talk to police officers, what they tell me often is they would like to have more counseling services. One of them told me they want to make it mandatory because there's a stigma that goes along with getting counseling services after an incident, and they would prefer if it was mandatory, so they would have to get it. It wouldn't then be subject to that stigma. I want to make sure that all public employees are compensated well for the work that they do. We just had that conversation about public employees, because I think it not only respects their work, whether they're a police officer, a firefighter, or a teacher. You know, often, particularly in teaching, we have this conversation about accountability. It's all about, we're going to hold the teachers accountable, we're going to hold the police accountable, we're going to hold these people accountable. And accountability is the tail side of a two-sided coin. The other side of that coin is support and capacity building. You have to build people's capacity to do the thing you're trying to hold them accountable for.
If you want accountability, you've got to...
Right. And so I take that stance with teachers. You know, everyone knows I support teachers. It's funny, everyone knows I support teachers. A lot of folk don't know my record of holding teachers accountable. I do both. And I think everyone knows I want to hold police accountable, but people don't understand the flip side of that coin. I want to make sure that police get the support and capacity building they need to do their jobs. And so I think that there's some things about me that Kevin Graham will like, and there's some things about me he won't. There's some things about me that teachers will like. That's one of my biggest support bases. And there's things about me that they won't. But I think they'll respect the balanced approach that I bring to negotiations with public employees, that we're going to hold you accountable. We're going to be making sure that the service that the people of Chicago get from you is a good service, that it is biased, is as much as possible a biased-free service, whether it's in education or policing. But we're also going to give you the support and capacity building that you need to do your job and do it well.
Do you have enough cops?
And so if we have enough cops to set up bait trucks, if we have enough police officers, if our staffing is, we have enough police officers to create a situation where in Lincoln Park, you have 5 bicycling tickets. And in Austin, a predominantly black community, in the same time period, you have 397 bicycling tickets. Like, it's not about, for me, do we have enough? It's what are we doing with the capacity we already have? 300, we're using our police force to exploit communities. That is not a proper use of the time of public employees, whether they be police or teachers. That is, and this isn't about the police. This is about the people giving them their assignment from on high. Those 397 tickets in Austin and 5 tickets in Lincoln Park, bicycling tickets. Now, I've ridden my bike in Lincoln Park. People run red lights, or ride through red lights in Lincoln Park just as much as they would. Actually, they do more because there's more bicycling. There's more bicycling happening in Lincoln Park. You hardly ever see a bike in Austin. And yet they found the ability, they have the ability to get 397 tickets. There's cyclists everywhere in Lincoln Park, breaking as many laws as anybody else, but they only get 5 tickets. Someone from on high made a determination that we're going to use our police force to exploit this community and dozens of other communities like it all across the city. That is not how the time of our police should be used. And so we have to do a top to bottom radical assessment or reassessment of how we use the time of our police. What is the purpose? Is it to arrest, to exploit, to oppress, or is it to build relationships with community members, to do investigative work and invest in investigative works that keep our community safe? It doesn't seems like we're saying one thing, but when we look how our public officials use our police force, we're doing quite a different thing. And so that has to change.
One of your opponents is Gary McCarthy, and he's been at this table, and he very proudly points to the fact that while he was, when he was initially police superintendent, crime went down, deaths went down, homicides went down, and it was only after he was basically his wings were clipped and when he was removed that the street crime went back up again. Response to that?
Yes, I do have a response to that. I think anyone who hears that should go to a 2013-2014 Chicago Magazine investigation of those crime statistics that showed that they rigged murder statistics in order to make it look as if crime was going down. There was a woman, for instance, found naked, bound, and gagged in a warehouse, dead. They classified it as a non-criminal death investigation instead of a homicide. And they reclassified dozens of murders just like that, all across the city that were obviously murders, but reclassified them as non-criminal death investigations to make it look as if the homicide rate went down. Now, if that is not repulsive enough, we have to understand that when you don't classify a murder as a murder, guess what you don't get? A murder investigation. And so the people who killed those people, who murdered those people, were allowed to go free so that McCarthy and Emanuel can have a press conference and claim that the murder rate has gone down. It is disgusting, it is unethical, and McCarthy, was at the center of this strategy. It is my understanding that that's part of why he brought him in from New York to come to Chicago and implement this statistical manipulation strategy, this allow murderers to go free strategy, so that they can then have a press conference and repeat and state a talking point that he's still repeating to this day. So I think it's disgusting, and I think he needs to be called out on it. Him and the mayor he worked for.
I am always reluctant to ask the question, what will you do about our street crime, about the shootings in the in the all over the city, but obviously we all know what we're talking about. And I know that the answer is always, well, it's so much bigger because it involves disinvestment and racism and everything else. But the fact of the matter is that on your second day in office, you're going to have a press conference and Fran Spielman is going to say, what are you going to do about crime? What are you going to do about street crime?
So I'll say to Fran, take a trip up to Lake Forest or Wilmette. They don't have much crime there. Do you think it's because of their policing strategy? Do you think it's because of their policing strategy? Right? Policing certainly comes into the picture, and it is part of my strategy. But to go back to your first point, if we don't get our schools, our educational opportunities, and our economic opportunities, job opportunities together, we're going to be setting police up to fail. With that said, those are the first two priorities: economic development and educational reform, and ensuring that we have an exceptional neighborhood schools in every single community in this city. I think that's going to do quite a bit. But then there's policing strategies. The fact that we don't invest in building relationships. We incentivize police to arrest. We need to incentivize police to build relationships. You're not going to be judged on how many arrests you made under my watch. You're going to be judged based on how many relationships you've built. How many people did you get to know? How many folks do you know and know you on a first name basis? How many community events did you attend? How many people that you got to know before did you go back to build on that relationship and then build the kind of trust that you can then lean on and rely on when it is time to investigate a crime or investigate a murder, that you have the kind of deep community relationships that enable you to solve murders and actually put people away when they commit offenses against the community they serve. I think also having the opposite strategy in terms of restorative justice. Restorative justice has been shown far more than prison or jail time to actually change the behavior of people who have committed criminal offenses if it's done the right way. And so I think having restorative justice practices. But then there are certain practices where certain crimes where people just need to be found and put away. When you murder someone, that's not a restorative justice, not a case for restorative justice. And if someone is murdered and we don't have the relationships or the investigative capacity to find them, they're going to murder again. And so these people have to be found and they have to be brought to justice. We don't have a police force that is organized, and they haven't built the relationship capacity or the investigative capacity to make sure that that happens. And that's going to happen under my watch.
Eddie Johnson, he's not calling you. He's like sitting out in the waiting room, waiting to talk to you. He'd like to talk to you too about a few things. But Eddie Johnson says many of the very same things you say. He's from the community. He's been in the system all his life, and he sees all of these issues. And I think, from everything I can tell, is a decent human being with a fairly sharp mind and understands those root problems. But he can't even get the murder, the clearance rate up above 7% or whatever it is.
Right.
Is that because he's just not any good at what he's doing, or is it because these problems are just so intractable that you just can't decide day to day which piece of it you want to tackle?
So what we have to understand is that Eddie Johnson does not run the police department any more than Janice Jackson runs our school system. Anybody who's the head of a department under this administration is a highly paid spokesperson. That's your job. That's his job as the police chief, to be a spokesperson for the agenda of the mayor's office. That's the job of the CEO of CPS, to be a spokesperson for the agenda of the mayor's office. And so I don't know who the real Eddie Johnson is. I know what the mayor's office puts in his mouth. I don't know who the real Janice Jackson is. I know the talking points they give her to repeat. They don't run these respective departments. These departments are ran by the mayor's office.
And you would let them run themselves?
So, absolutely. One of the things I
You would
brought,
say to Janice Jackson, or whoever you
Yeah.
replace her with, or
I would
whatever,
replace her with I would put someone in who has a record of effectiveness in reforming and improving educational institutions. A team of people who have a good record of reforming and improving the performance of the institutions that they're supposed to run, and let them advise me. That's how we made Blaine the #1 neighborhood school in Chicago. I didn't go in knowing everything about how to run a school. I wasn't an engineer. I didn't have a background in special education. I didn't have a background in curriculum. I brought in good people and let them advise me, and I used my own skills and talents as well. I brought what I had into the picture, and in those areas where I was not experts, I brought people in. But you can't do that if you're corrupt, because if you're corrupt, then you bring in the people who are connected. You bring in the people from the banks. You bring in the folks who the real estate developers want to divert money. But when you're not taking their money, you're free to do the right thing by the people of Chicago, and that's certainly what I'm going to do.
It sounded like you made a little bit of news there. Are you saying that you would, definitively, you would replace Janice Jackson?
I'm going to bring in someone who has a record of competence and effectiveness in running educational institutions. The last time I looked at the college persistence rate of the school that she ran, when you looked at schools that started with similar students, I did this analysis, and I wasn't even looking at her stuff. I was looking at the charter school college persistence rate, and I was comparing the charter school college persistence rate with the public school college persistence rates, but only with kids who had the same starting ACT score, so they could be an apples to apples comparison.
This is when she was a principal.
Right. And I was looking in the charters, and all the Noble Street charter chain in particular was dead last in the college persistence rate, and the public schools were all at the top. But there was only one public school that was down there dead last with those charters, and it just happened to be the public high school that was ran by our current CEO. And so I have to look at the evidence when making that kind of decision, and that evidence does not bode well for her retaining her position. You know, under this administration, all you have to do to get that position is to be able to repeat talking points faithfully. You're going to have to be able to do a lot more than that under my administration.
I've always said that I agree with what you said about what the role of those key department heads is, but I think the secondary role, maybe the primary role, is to be available to be fired when things get really bad. I mean, that's in your job description. When it gets really bad, you're gone. So you're talking about maybe you'll do the same thing.
I'm going to do whatever is best for the interests of the public that I serve, and I'm going to bring in the best people to do it, and if that means making room for the best people in order to do that by ensuring that that room exists by getting certain people out, then that's what I'm going to do.
We really can't spend a lot more time talking because the head of World Business Chicago is on the line, and he is freaking out. I mean, he's like screaming at me, and he's saying all the businesses are going to start leaving Chicago today because you just got elected. And I don't even know if he wants to talk to you. He just wants to yell at you. Will you take the call?
I will take any call.
By the way, may I just say, for those of you listening to the audio podcast of this, our guest today is Troy LaRaviere. He is a candidate for mayor. He was the first to announce. So I'm sorry, I interrupted.
And so Crane Chicago Business had a report, a survey they did about maybe 2 years ago. And they surveyed the business community. And they asked people in the business community if the fix was in contracts with the city and getting city business. And an overwhelming majority of them said yes, that we have to be more precise when we talk about the business community, because it's not a monolithic community. There are those who are well connected and those who are not. There's some in the business community who are businessmen in the sense that Frank and Jesse James were bankers, right? And so we have to differentiate. And so When we're talking about the legitimate business community, people who provide a good or a service and just want a fair shot at a city contract, I think those people will love my administration and love the change that we bring about to make it fair. I think those who, like an Aramark Corporation or a Sodexo Magic, who needed to be, like, if you have a good quality product, look at the soups contract, for example. That's one we absolutely know was corrupt.
Yes,
They
we do.
came in and provided this principal training. That's a business, right?
Yeah.
We talk about businesses, that's a business,
Yeah.
right? They had a product, principal training. Now, if it's a good product, then you sell your product, you talk about its effectiveness, you give examples.
You stand
show-
up against the other
you
people who
show
are providing this.
testimonials.
You compete.
If it is not a good product, then you know you can't do that. You know you have to have an in and you have to bribe someone and give them $2.3 million so that they can bring this absolutely horrendous training, this service, if we can call it that, into the district. Right? Corruption breeds incompetence. When people talk about corrupt government, we miss the other half of that. What corrupts government? Business, right? Business, Soups was a business. Aramark is a business. Sodexo is a business. The red light camera operation and that was a business that corrupted an elected official. And so all businesses aren't like that. But again, we can't treat it like a monolith. So the businesses that are corrupt, that engage in pay to play, they're not going to be happy with my administration. But people who just want a fair shot at a city contract, decent rules and revenue regulations by which they can operate, I am certain they will welcome a LaRaviere administration.
And now we have to interrupt this meeting because the advocates for better housing are here. The housing lobby is here,
Right.
and they're saying that things are really, really terrible. Affordable housing is disappearing in Chicago. Gentrification is burning it all up. It's impossible to live in Chicago. You can't even rent an apartment for less than $1,500, and if you're earning $8 an hour, you can't do it. And they're saying it's your problem now. You got to fix it.
Absolutely. Well, it's all of our problems, but I'm certainly going to be taking the lead at that. In that, we have to understand that there are interests lined up that create that problem, and one of those interests, for example, are the luxury real estate developers. You are never going to, if you're an elected official, create policies that increase the availability of affordable housing if you're taking millions of dollars from real estate developers who profit from the lack of affordable housing. That's not going to happen. But to look at the problem overall, I see it three-pronged. We are not producing enough new affordable housing. Number two, we are not preserving existing affordable housing, both in the private sector and public housing. Mm-hmm. We're not preserving existing affordable housing to the extent that we need to. And three, the key word in affordable housing is affordable, which means that housing is not affordable either because the rents are too high or people are not making enough money. And so that means increasing the availability of subsidies, that's not happening to the degree it needs to happen. And we found out that the CHA is holding on to about $500 million in money that it could be making available to do all three of those things, particularly the last two: preserve existing public affordable housing and provide people subsidies. The other part of that last one is that housing is not affordable because people aren't making enough money. And so increasing the minimum wage, increasing the availability of many of the things we've already talked about in terms of not privatizing jobs so people can make enough money so that they can afford housing. And so increasing the availability of increasing new affordable housing, protecting existing affordable housing, and subsidizing the incomes or ensuring people are making enough money to afford housing in the first place. Those are going to be the primary priorities of my administration.
Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt. Barack Obama's on the line, and he wants to talk to you right away because he's just saying that he just hopes that you're not going to make me do a CBA out there in Jackson Park, are you? And we are going to build that library in Jackson Park, whether you like it or not. And I just wanted you to know that, Troy.
Give me the phone. I am on the side of the folk who want the CBA. I think if you say
that's a community benefits agreement.
Community benefits agreement. I think if you say that this institution is going to be a benefit, then you should be able to put it in writing. If you won't, the Amazon thing, for example, one of the things they did when they put out the request for proposals, or the RFP, was they said, basically, if you have clawback provisions, clawback provisions are not welcome. And clawback provisions simply state that if you don't live up to your promise, we get our public money back. Yeah. And if you don't want to put that in writing, then you don't plan on doing it. It's that simple. You probably are not actually planning on creating 50,000 jobs. It's just a number you made up to get us to give you our tax
at
dollars.
$100,000.
And so I think the same, at $100,000 each. And I think this. So I think I have a similar analysis of any project, whether it be the Obama Library or Amazon. You should be able to put what you say the community is going to get out of this in writing. And I think many of the things in the agreement are certainly, they should want. Partnerships with local schools, educational partnerships with local schools is one. Ensuring that the value of property, which is sure to rise with the introduction of that institution in that community, doesn't ensure that there's a rental assistance for people who are going to have trouble. That is a reasonable request, and so I think that those are just two examples of what I think is a very reasonable proposal for a community benefits agreement. So I certainly agree with it, and I will encourage the president to remember his roots as a community organizer, pushing people to demand things like this from projects like this, and stay true to those roots.
One of the things that I've been generally supportive of Rahm Emanuel about is his record on public transit and getting investment in public transit. The Red Line, both north and south, a lot of reconstruction of tracks and stations, and building a plant that's going to build a couple of thousand L cars right here in Chicago and Pullman. So I will state my bias that I think it's one of the places where Rahm Emanuel has been a very good mayor. He's been the best public transit mayor of my lifetime, I think. Are you going to keep that going? Well, let me ask you the question better. Is public transit the future, or is rideshare and app-based transportation the future? And is it really are we at the end of bus? We don't need buses anymore? Should we replace them with maybe some kind of publicly owned Uber, Lyft that just, what are you thinking about that?
I think about this in a way that's similar to how I think about public education. When you disinvest in public schools and you create a situation where people want to go to their neighborhood schools, but they know the classroom is overcrowded. They know it is understaffed. They know it doesn't have the curriculum that is available in other schools, then they will take another option. But their preference would be to have a well-funded, fully staffed public school right in their neighborhood. I think if we don't have public transit options that are as convenient or well-funded or well organized and available, then people will resort to rideshare, or people will, I started taking the Metro when I was maybe about 8 years ago, and I
when
could
you
not
moved
believe.
out to Barrington.
Well, actually in Beverly. And I couldn't believe I had been driving so much. Like, it was the most convenient thing. It was, but I just happened to live moved to a place that was a few blocks away from it, so it was convenient for me. It was a great alternative. And I think if we invest in public transit, to get back to your question, whether it's the future or not, depends on, there's certain interests. The Koch brothers, for instance, and I can't remember the city, but put a lot of money behind an effort to defeat a proposal.
Yes, they did.
To increase public transportation, to support public transportation, because that then creates a situation where the oil industry benefits less because if public transportation is thriving, then people are driving less. The auto industry benefits less because people are not buying and using as many cars. And so there are interests out there who want the lack of public transportation to be the future. And then there are other interests who want public transportation to be the future. And there's a fight there. And when it comes to that fight, I am squarely on the side of increasing the availability and convenience of public transportation. It not only is good policy in regard to transportation, but it has positive impacts on our environment and on our ability to be a community as a city. And also, when you have public transportation, you can then extend economic development opportunities along the lines of that public transportation. You know, businesses, commercial corridors that you can then develop because you're creating these hubs where people congregate, where people visit regularly throughout the day.
I raised that question more in line with something like, excuse me, for the 130th Street extension of the Red Line, and I think, you know, we might be actually talking about a point where it might be a better idea to look at more innovative ways of doing it than running heavy rail all the way down there. But we don't have time. We've run out of time. We can't do it. Okay. Gregory Livingston is sitting out in the office. Jesse Sharkey, Eddie Johnson's out there, but we'll just have to. They're going to have to talk to you another day. I do want to spend the minute and a half we have left just talking about the election process. I went to the ICPR website and I see that you have about $10,000 in your account right now, and $6,500 of that was from you yourself. How's fundraising going?
We've actually raised about $60,000, so I'm not over the.
Oh, okay. I looked at
campaign.
I looked at the wrong page. I hope I did. It looked
over the course of the
weird,
campaign.
but...
We've actually raised about $60,000.
Okay,
I had an entirely volunteer staff for the first 6 to 7 months. And now we have brought on a professional fundraiser, a professional campaign manager. And so we expect to pick that up, particularly since petitioning is starting. And if people want to support the campaign, please visit troyforchicago.com, troyforchicago.com.
You're going to make the $12,500 or more than that? You're going to make about $20,000?
Actually, our goal is about 35,000 to 40,000 signatures.
Good. I'm sorry we ran out of time. We're just crashing and burning here at the end of the show. Troy LaRaviere, thank you so much for being with us again.
Thank you so much, Ken.
And as we always say, when you're mayor, we'd like to come and do the show occasionally from your office too, all right?
Absolutely.
You're committing to that?
I am committing to that right now.
Okay, all right. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom here on Ken TV. I'm Ken Davis. Thank you very much for watching. Remember, this is the place to go where you can watch this and all of our other shows all at the same time, or chicagonewsroom.org. And thanks to Troy for being here. And next week we're going to bring together an all-star panel, we hope, of media types to talk about what this all means for the mayor's race. And we're going to be talking all mayor all the time for the next 20 weeks or so. All right, thanks a lot. See you next week. Bye-bye.